We are all great stories ready to be read, waiting to be read. We start young, reciting stories with our eyes closed until we learn to read the inks of pens, like how sailors use the stars to guide themselves home. The first thing we learn as children are stories. Books read to incite imagination and spur on education. We are taught that the truth is way stranger than fiction. We are taught how to turn fantasies into realities with exaggeration of mouth, to dive headfirst into a novel, and kick our legs and swing our arms until we scrape the surface. We weep for those that we have woven into our imaginations, intertwine their essence into our own, but they exist in our memories. We sing tales of Gregor the Overlander, of Maximum Ride, of boys who were forced to become men long before their times, of little girls who could do nothing but stare into the ashes as childhood itself collapsed around them. We play these memories back as if we lived in their shoes because we saw life through their eyes. My grandfather used to tell me Ghanaian folk tales, stories passed from his father's father down generations until these fables grazed my ear. These stories, passed down by word of mouth, folded between lips, written with the inks of tongues, sealed with whispers. We are all great stories ready to be read, waiting to be read. We are all storybooks, some with blank paperbacks and others with ink sewn into bloodskins. Some stories we tell in our dreams, the same way my freshman college roommate talks in her sleep. And some stories we bury underneath our tongues, those we were too scared to share, and those we thought were unnecessary. We leave our stories on the backs of receipts, in the songs that we sing and the laughs that we bring. We are all great stories ready to be read, waiting to be read. But sometimes it is us that are not ready to read. Some stories we are not mature enough to read, mature enough to know that not all stories end happily, and some stories end with broken hearts and lost dreams. Some stories sting. The way we slice our fingers on the edges, we put blood on the paper with paper cuts. We stain the pages with tears. What words do we use for pain when language is not enough? When sounds are not enough? There are some who would rather rip the pages, bend the binding, cut the words to make them less whole. Some who would rather get rid of the entire shelf, set it all on fire, never let the souls rejoice to finish their life's desire. We are all great stories ready to be read and waiting to be read. Some stories we try to force ourselves to forget. Some stories we can't help but to recall, like the plot of our favorite tales popping up in our memories, nostalgia mixed with whiplashed evanescence. We are all great stories ready to be read and waiting to be read. I am not my favorite story, but I want to be. I hope that one day I get to fill all the pages in my tale. We are all great stories ready to be read and waiting to be read, but our stories do not end with us. They live on in our children, and our families and friends with every tear-stained laughter, with each artifact we leave behind. We live on in their memories. We are all fantastic stories. I hope I get the chance to read yours. Thank you. That's actually an original poem that I wrote myself. I titled it Sonder. Sonder can simply be defined as the realization that everyone that you have ever passed, everyone you have ever caught a glimpse of, has a life and memories just as vivid as your own. Imagine that. Everyone here has a life just as vivid as your own. My talk is based on a personal philosophy that I have, that we are all great stories ready to be read, waiting to be read. And what do I mean by that? I mean that each and every one of us are stories, memories packed together, values and choices. And every day we're new, we are altered. And every person that you have ever met, a fragment of their story is added onto yours. So the first thing I want to say is, what is a story? And that's a bit basic, but I always like to start at the foundation. A story is gossip. It's facts and fictions. It's opinions. We have always been wrapped in a story, whether we realize it or not. Whether it was nursery rhymes, bedtime whispers that your mom would tell you so you could finally go to sleep, cartoons and comics. I also want to say that, I don't have a slide here. That's all because of the story, You imagine it in your head. So just imagine there's a slide somewhere, and that's cool. So, if that's a story, then what is storytelling? Storytelling is an easy way to connect with people. Whether you know it or not, every human dabbles in the art of storytelling. It's a great way to communicate with someone. For example, I could say, "Hello, my name's Nana Ohima. Sorry I'm late, there was so much traffic on the green." That's a story. You've already been transported to a place that you do not currently inhabit, and you're somewhere else. Storytelling is a fundamental and universal skill. Every culture uses it. One of my earliest memories is sitting with my grandfather and him telling me stories. One of my favorites was the talkative tortoise, you have to be specific, a talkative tortoise who would just keep talking and talking, so much so that his friends left him. Another one of my favorite stories was that of Anansi the spider, the original trickster, who would go around antagonizing God and other creatures. And my grandfather told me these stories to teach me how to be a better person. Ohima, listen more than you talk. These are why spiders weave webs. And from these stories, I built them into my essence, and I became who I am today. There is one story that I would love to share with you, and it's very special to my heart. And my grandfather taught me a way of telling stories that I would like you all to participate. It's like a call and response. So when I say once upon a time, you will respond with time, time. Are you ready? Yes. Once upon a time. Oh, snap. Okay. We're going to do this one more time. Once upon a time. Great. There once was a storyteller named Seth Asante. He had traveled all the way from Ghana to New York to see his sons and grandchildren. And when his sons had heard the news, they gathered their children, and from several states over, they went to New York. In a packed apartment, in a very kind of shady neighborhood, Seth Asante had his children and his grandchildren sit around him. And he taught them a way to accept the story told with the truest of intentions. His stories stayed with his children and his grandchildren, and they stayed with me, even though my grandfather passed away a couple weeks ago. His stories stay with me, and I plan to pass them down even more so. And I think that's what's really interesting about storytelling and stories, is that now you all are a part of my story just as much as I am a part of yours. This connection that we share is something that is not easily broken. An interesting thing about stories is that they last generations. Some have started before us, and some will end after us. My story started long ago, on the palm prints of my mother's grandmother's hands, worn from cooking and cleaning and raising all of her children and grandchildren. And yet my story has only just begun. Every day I teach myself what it means to pick up a pencil and pen and write my tale down. And I remind myself what it means to live and what I want to live for. Every day, I recall what it means to be a storyteller, and I do my best to tell my story the best way I can. And that's the great thing about stories, too, that my own stories are fragments of my friends and my family, and that every story that they have given me, that I have taken them with the inks of tongues and with not worn hands, and I have pressed these patterns down onto my own pages. What I told you in Sonder was true. I am not my favorite story, but I want to be. And every day, even on the hardest of days, I remind myself of why I can be my favorite story. That we love characters not because they're perfect, but because of their flaws. Robert Downey Jr. or Tony Stark is loved because of his flaws. We love our characters because of the things that they strive to achieve. And I will learn to love me because of the things that I strive to achieve. And I hope you will learn to love yourself for the things that you strive to achieve. We are all great stories ready to be read and waiting to be read. And if so, I ask you this. What is it that you want your story to say? Earlier on, I described what a story was, and to end my talk, I want to describe what an adventure is to me. An adventure is anything that I want it to be. And an adventure to you is anything that you want it to be too. Will we leave fingerprints on glass panes and hope that someone will recognize them? Or will we leave our stories as a legacy? We may not have chosen our backstory, but the current components of our tales are still in our hands. You are the author to your tale, the artist. Your story is an adventure. Make it a good one. Thank you.